The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical song at 6 in the morning, and Megan O'Brien moved through St. Michael's ICU like water finding the path of least resistance. 8 months. 244 days of 12-hour shifts, of charting with surgical precision, of hands that threaded 4 lines without tremor or hesitation. The antiseptic air tasted the same every morning: bleach, ozone, something underneath that smelled like metal and quiet desperation. She was checking the ventilator settings on room 342 when Dr. Caldwell found her in the hallway. He had a gift for timing, for arriving at moments designed to diminish. His white coat hung immaculate, pressed sharp enough to draw blood, and his smile contained no warmth whatsoever. Miss O'Brien. Not a greeting. An indictment. She turned. Met his eyes. Said nothing. Your documentation is improving. He paused, and in that pause lived an entire ocean of contempt. Though I noticed your supply requisitions remain unusual. The community clinics in Chula Vista, they might appreciate your work ethic more than we can here at St. Michael's. Less demanding environment. More forgiving standards. The words hung between them like poison gas. She did not flinch. Did not feel the heat rise in her chest, or if she did, she locked it down the way she locked down everything else, the way you lock down fear in a firefight, the way you lock down pain when shrapnel is still embedded in your ribs and the casualty you're treating won't stop screaming. Her jaw tightened. Half a second. No more. I understand, Dr. Caldwell. Her voice sat level, calm, the voice of someone reading a grocery list. I'll review my ordering patterns. He waited for something, a crack, a waver, some sign that his words had landed like they were supposed to. She gave him nothing. The silence stretched until he turned on his heel and moved down the corridor, his footsteps sharp against the tile floor, and Megan watched him go with eyes that had watched far worse things than a surgeon's arrogance. What he didn't know, what nobody at St. Michael's knew, was that naval intelligence had placed her here 8 months ago, specifically embedded in this ICU, specifically assigned to a man lying comatose in room 347 under a John Doe designation. The burned patient. The one with no visitors, no family, no one asking questions. The one whose face she had recognized the moment they wheeled him through the ER doors, despite the bandaging and the thermal injuries that had turned his skin to leather. General Marcus Sterling. 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, a dark horse. The man who had pulled her out of a collapsing field hospital in Marja 14 years ago, who had held the west perimeter for 16 hours while she and 2 Navy corpsmen had tried to save bodies that were beyond saving. He had taken shrapnel meant for her. She still carried the scar on her left ribs, purple-white and raised like a brand. She walked to room 347 and stood in the doorway. The ventilator wheezed its mechanical rhythm, pushing air into lungs that refused to work on their own. His burned hand lay on top of the blanket, and she noticed, again, as she had noticed every single day for 244 days, that his right ring finger was missing from the knuckle up. Trauma amputation. Combat injury. The kind of wound that told a story about a man who had grabbed something or someone to keep them from falling. She moved to his bedside. The monitors beeped their endless songs. Blood pressure holding at 118/76. Heart rate 67. O2 sat 94 on minimal support, good, better than yesterday. She reached into her pocket and her fingers found the tarnished challenge coin, the one she carried from her first deployment, the one that had traveled through 8 years and 3 continents and sat now heavy as a stone in the fabric of her scrubs. She didn't remove it. She just held it there, a tether to the person she had been before she became the invisible nurse. The patient's chart sat at the foot of his bed, and she picked it up with a kind of focus that turned her entire being into a scanner. Her eyes moved across the intake documentation, and something caught, a small thing, the kind of inconsistency that a normal person would miss, that most nurses would miss, but Megan O'Brien had spent 14 years training to notice details that could kill you. The ER intake noted time of arrival as 2,247 hours. Emergency medicine resident noted unknown mechanism of injury, patient unresponsive. Thermal burns consistent with IED secondary blast pattern. The documentation said this in careful, clinical language, but the pattern itself was specific, the kind of specific that only appeared in combat zones. Only appeared in Marja. Only appeared when something classified had gone very wrong. She made a note on the chart, reviewing medication reconciliation. Inconsistencies in arrival vitals versus current baseline. Recommend cardiology consult for pre-existing arrhythmia evaluation. Buried inside bureaucratic language was a message that someone in the intelligence community would read, someone who was waiting for her to confirm that the patient had arrived alive and stable and that she was still on the job. The chart closed with a soft whisper of paper. She was walking back toward the med room when she heard the laughter, two voices, male, easy, the kind of careless sound that only people who had never been afraid could make. The vending machine stood at the far end of the hallway, fluorescent lit and humming like a mechanical insect. Two orderlies stood in front of it, their scrubs dark with sweat from moving bodies heavier than their own, and one of them was speaking in that particular tone, the one that made her shoulders recognize danger without her mind catching up. "Little nurse thinks she's gonna save the world," the taller one was saying, laughing. His voice had the shape of cruelty in it, the deliberate kind. "Did you see Caldwell put her in her place in grand rounds? The way she just stood there? Like a statue. Probably gonna go cry herself to sleep." The second one snorted. Shook his head. Neither of them noticed her until she was directly beside the machine, reaching for water. They didn't acknowledge her. She was background noise, part of the furniture. She was the little nurse who didn't cry back, who didn't yell, who just took it and came back the next shift, and that made her safe to mock. That made her invisible. Megan pressed the button. Water began to fill the cup. 1, 2, 3 seconds. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like insects trapped in glass. "I'm going on break," she said to no one in particular, to both of them, her voice soft as a knife. She took the water and walked past them toward the stairwell, and in her pocket, her fingers released the tarnished coin and curled into a fist. She had survived worse than two orderlies laughing. She had survived Marja. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was what she had discovered 2 hours ago when she was reviewing the pharmacy reconciliation logs, the medication orders for room 347, the ones that didn't match the patient's actual pharmacy records, the ones that bore Dr. Caldwell's authorization code but listed medications that no trauma patient on his intake protocol should have been receiving. The worst part was understanding, with the kind of clarity that came from reading every single chart obsessively, that the comatose general in room 347 wasn't here by accident. Someone had tried to keep him quiet. Someone had tried to keep him dead. And that someone was moving through the halls of St. Michael's in an immaculate white coat, ordering supply requisitions, suggesting that she might be better suited for a community clinic, completely unaware that the woman he was trying to drive away was the only thing standing between him and a federal investigation that was already 4 steps behind. She reached the stairwell and descended alone, her footsteps echoing in the concrete space, and in her pocket, the tarnished challenge coin sat waiting, a promise she had made 14 years ago to a man who had chosen to bleed so she could keep breathing. Conference room B smelled like recycled air and ambition. 12 residents sat in descending rows of chairs, laptops open, coffee cooling in paper cups, attention scattered until Dr. Caldwell entered. He moved with the careful precision of a man who'd learned long ago that posture was power, shoulders back, chin elevated, white coat unbuttoned just enough to reveal the monogrammed cufflinks beneath. The projector hummed to life. Her medication logs appeared on the screen, magnified to 10 times their clinical significance. "Class," Caldwell began, his voice carrying the weight of someone used to being obeyed, "observe this example of dangerously sloppy documentation." He tapped the screen with a laser pointer, the red dot circling timestamps, dosage notations, verification signatures. Medications logged at intervals that violate hospital protocol. Notice the pattern, this nurse documents in bunches rather than real-time entries. Shortcuts. Carelessness. He paused, letting each word settle like sediment in still water. Miss O'Brien here demonstrates precisely why nursing education standards have declined across the nation. Megan stood against the back wall of Conference Room B, her back exactly 6 inches from the institutional beige paint, feet positioned at shoulder width, and clasped behind her back. She did not move. She did not flinch. Her jaw muscle twitched once, a single involuntary firing of fibers under stress, but her eyes remained fixed on a point above the residents' heads, focused on nothing, which meant she was focused on everything. This was the posture she'd learned in 2006 at Coronado, maintained through briefings where superior officers questioned judgment calls that had saved lives. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. A resident in the third row smirked, nudging the colleague next to him. The gesture lasted exactly 2 seconds. Caldwell's eyes caught it and held it for a fraction longer, approving. The chief nursing officer, Patricia Vance, sat in the front row with her tablet open, her eyes suddenly very interested in something on the screen that had nothing to do with Megan's charts. She had introduced Megan to the ICU 8 months ago. She did not look back now. Perhaps our little nurse needs remedial charting classes, Caldwell continued, and the condescension in his voice was a weapon he'd honed through years of wielding it without consequence. Fortunately, St. Michael's maintains rigorous standards. We cannot tolerate this level of documentation. He clicked to the next slide, another log, another set of timestamps, another opportunity to publicly dismantle her credibility in front of the people she would work alongside for the next 3 months. This is what happens when hiring departments don't verify credentials properly. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed their monotonous frequency. Megan's breathing remained flat and measured. Her posture did not collapse. Her face did not flush. She was a stone monument in scrubs, immobile as a court-martial witness, and the power in her absolute refusal to break was something Caldwell could sense but not measure, which infuriated him more than any argument could have. The grand rounds lasted 47 minutes. Megan's charts appeared on screen for 8 of them. When Caldwell finished, he dismissed the residents with a wave, his attention already moving to the next item on his agenda, which meant he had already moved on from his annihilation of her. To him, this was nothing. To the residents filing out, it was spectacle, a demonstration that even the quiet ones could be dismantled if they made the mistake of drawing attention. Megan waited until the room had emptied, then walked out last, her pace neither hurried nor lingering, her hands at her sides now, her challenge coin heavy in her pocket like a promise. 2 hours later, by the third-floor vending machines near the break room, 2 orderlies stood feeding dollar bills into the snack dispenser. Their voices carried the particular volume of men who didn't care who heard them. Did you see Caldwell roast the Ice Queen in grand rounds? The taller one, Marcus, had been working night shift for 3 years and had never once been challenged by anyone. Bet she goes home and cries into her cat. Little nurse probably can't even spell protocol, the second orderly said, and they both laughed, the sound like glass breaking in slow motion. Their laughter was the particular cruelty of men who had never been forced to examine their own competence, so they defaulted to mocking those who displayed it. Megan heard them from the stairwell 30 feet away. She did not pause. She did not change her pace. She walked past them toward room 347 with the same measured gait she'd used in Kandahar when mortar fire painted the compound, and she'd carried a lieutenant with a shattered femur through blood-slicked dirt to a waiting Black Hawk. The orderly's laughter followed her down the corridor, then faded. Some people could be hurt by mockery. She had been trained in an institution where mockery was the lightest form of corrective action. Room 347 was silent except for the rhythmic beeping of the cardiac monitor and the soft hiss of oxygen flowing through the ventilator. The burned patient lay motionless, his bandaged hands resting on the isolation blanket. Megan checked his vitals, blood pressure stable, O2 saturation holding at 93% on the current settings, heart rate regular. His medication log was immaculate. She had documented every intervention with the precision of someone who understood that paperwork was the only thing protecting a patient from institutional indifference. She adjusted his for, checking the line for infiltration with hands that had trembled once in her entire military career, and that had been during her first combat injury briefing, not during the actual injury. The afternoon shift brought Dr. Caldwell to the nurse's station at 3:13 p.m. He arrived like weather arriving, unavoidable and deliberate. Megan was reviewing labs on the computer terminal, her back to the entrance, her awareness of his presence immediate and complete. "Miss O'Brien," he said, and the use of her name rather than nurse or use made it clear this was personal now. "I've contacted your references from your previous hospital. St. Catherine's in San Diego, correct?" She turned to face him. "Yes, doctor." "Interesting," he continued, stepping closer enough that she could smell the expensive cologne he wore, something that cost more than her weekly salary. "Interesting that no one seems to remember you. The nursing director, the charge nurse, the ICU supervisor, all blanks. It's as if you didn't exist for your entire tenure." She said nothing. This was not a question. "I'm watching you, Miss O'Brien." His smile was the kind that revealed teeth but no warmth, the kind worn by predators who had learned to mimic human emotion. "One more documentation error and I'll have security escort you out personally. One medication discrepancy, one procedure logged improperly, one anything that gives me cause. Am I clear?" "Crystal clear, doctor," she said, and her voice came out steady as a respirator, no inflection, no fear, which somehow made it worse for him because she had refused him the satisfaction of her distress. He held her eyes for 3 seconds, then turned away, his posture asserting that he had won this exchange. Megan turned back to her charts and continued her work. Her pen pressed down on the documentation in front of her, harder than necessary, pressing so hard that the ballpoint indented not just the current page but the 2 pages beneath it. The impression went deep. The evidence of force was there, in the physical substrate, in the only place where her composure had cracked. She noticed it immediately and forced her grip to relax, but the damage was already done. The paper bore the marks of her restraint, small physical evidence that she was not, in fact, the ice queen the orderlies had mocked. She was something else entirely, something that was burning at temperatures high enough to melt steel, and the only place that fire could show was in the inadvertent pressure of her pen against institutional forms. At 0200 hours Thursday morning, the alarms began. Room 347's monitor started screaming, a staccato shriek that cut through the quiet hospital night like a blade through silk. Megan was on her feet before her conscious mind had fully processed the sound. The night shift nurse call bell was ringing. The ventilator alarm was cycling. She was moving toward the door, muscle memory taking over, her hands already reaching for the crash cart outside the room. The patient's neck was distended. Swollen. The veins were engorged like tributaries flooding from a broken dam. His breath sounds on the right side were absent for silence that spoke louder than any monitor alarm. Distant breath sounds on the left. His chest rising but not moving air. His blood pressure was falling. 78/45. 71/39. The numbers were descending toward irreversibility. Tension pneumothorax. Collapsed lung. Air trapped in the chest cavity, compressing his heart, compressing his lungs, compressing everything toward failure. "Go to room 347, she called out, her voice steady, her hands moving through the crash cart with the precision of someone who had done this so many times that hesitation was not an option. She pulled a 14-gauge needle decompression kit from the emergency supplies, her fingers finding the equipment through muscle memory alone. The second intercostal space. Midclavicular line. She had done this before, on a living patient, on a mountain ridge in Marja, with incoming fire and an army medic bleeding out from shrapnel wounds and a decision that had to be made in exactly 3 seconds. She knew where to push. She knew how much pressure. She knew the angle. An EMT stood in the doorway, a man named Rodriguez who'd brought a trauma patient from the ER 30 minutes earlier and was waiting for discharge paperwork. He froze mid-step, his eyes locked on her hands, on her grip, on the angle of her wrist. He was watching her work with the intensity of someone who recognized something impossible. "Holy shit," he whispered, his voice barely audible beneath the alarms. "You're using the Marja protocol, only combat medics from that sector know that grip." Megan's eyes met his for exactly 3 seconds. Cold. Flat. A color somewhere between gray and the sky before a storm. A stare that said volumes about the things she had seen and survived, and the things she would never speak about. Rodriguez looked away first. He always did. Everyone did. The needle went in. the hiss of air escaping, a sound like pressure releasing from a vessel that had been holding it for too long. The cardiac monitor shifted its rhythm. The blood pressure began climbing. 82/43. 90/46. The numbers ascending back toward stability, toward survival, toward the thin line between life and the alternative. Dr. Caldwell arrived 10 minutes later, when the patient was stabilized, when the crisis had passed, when he could review the charts and find nothing immediately damning about her actions. He photographed her documentation with his phone, his movements careful and deliberate, like a hunter photographing evidence at a crime scene. "You performed an advanced procedure without physician supervision, Miss O'Brien. A needle decompression is well outside the scope of nursing practice." His voice was quiet now, which made it more dangerous than any shouting could have been. "This will require formal incident review. I'll be submitting a report to risk management." She nodded once. She did not apologize. She did not explain. She simply returned her attention to the patient's vital signs, which were holding steady at acceptable levels, which were keeping him alive. When Caldwell left the room, she reached into her pocket and withdrew the tarnished military challenge coin, the one she'd carried since her first deployment in 2008, the one that weighed almost nothing and everything simultaneously. She set it on the bedside table, beside the patient's bandaged hand. His finger twitched toward it, a small involuntary movement, the kind that happens when the body recognizes something the mind hasn't yet processed. She noticed. He noticed her noticing. And in that moment, something shifted, because the burned man's eyes opened, fully opened, for the first time since his admission, and his gaze met hers with the clarity of someone who had just remembered exactly who he was. The general's eyes opened fully, and in that clarity lived a recognition that changed everything. He had just watched a nurse perform a procedure that only 300 people in the world knew how to execute, the classified field stabilization protocol taught exclusively in Marja to combat medics assigned to JSOC operations. His pupils dilated. His hand moved toward hers. And in the intercom speaker above room 347, a voice crackled, "Dr. Caldwell to administration. Emergency board meeting. Now." Megan felt the shift in air pressure before she heard the words. Biotelemetry data told stories if you knew how to read them. His heart rate had normalized from 127 to 89 BPM, blood pressure climbing from 70/40 to 10/62, oxygen saturation holding steady at 97%. The needle decompression had worked. The tension pneumothorax was resolved. The general was stable. But the intercom page meant something else entirely. Caldwell had moved to the next stage. Strategic escalation. And she was standing in the room where the evidence of her competence was written across every monitor screen. She reached for the challenge coin on his bedside table, the one she'd placed there hours ago, the one with its edges worn smooth by 18 years of pocket carry, the one whose significance she'd never spoken aloud. His burned hand trembled as he tried to reach it. She pressed it into his palm instead, held his gaze for exactly 2 seconds, and whispered, "Sir, I'm going on break now." The dry curl to her voice carried 18 years of combat medicine underneath it. Muscle memory. Composure under fire. Just like Marja had taught her. The elevator ride to administration felt like descending into a pressure chamber. Megan's scrubs were still damp with saline and the thin residue of cardiovascular trauma. Her hands were steady. They were always steady. That was the problem. The board conference room at St. Michael's occupied the entire north corner of the 3rd floor, all glass walls and mahogany veneer and a table that could seat 30. This morning it held 5 people, 3 hospital administrators she recognized by sight but had never spoken to, Dr. Caldwell standing near the window with his arms crossed like a man already counting his victory, and a 6th person she didn't recognize, lean, silver-haired, wearing a charcoal suit that cost more than Megan's monthly rent. The man introduced himself as Rick Morrison, risk management consultant, and his voice sounded like a tank idling in a parking garage, low, heavy, engineered for power. "Thank you for coming," Morrison said, and it wasn't a request. It was a command dressed in courtesy. Caldwell stepped forward, holding a folder so thick it needed both hands. Inside were medical records, hers, the general's, incident report she'd never filed. His voice carried the momentum of a man who had already won the argument before it started. "This nurse has demonstrated a dangerous pattern of operating beyond her scope of practice," he said, spreading pages across the mahogany table like evidence at a crime scene. During grand rounds 3 days ago, her medication documentation was so inadequate it required public correction. This morning, at approximately 0200 hours, she performed an advanced cardiac intervention without physician authorization, a needle decompression for suspected tension pneumothorax using a technique that violates hospital protocol and exposes us to significant liability. One of the administrators leaned forward. An older man, grey suit, the kind of face that had never stayed awake worrying about something he couldn't bill for. "Is this verified, Dr. Caldwell?" "Completely. I have witness statements." He produced another document. Morrison nodded gravely, made a note on a legal pad, said nothing. The silence stretched like a held breath before the gunshot. Megan stood near the door, hands at her sides, uniform still damp, vital steady as a stone. Her jaw was tight, not from fear, but from the calculation running beneath her composure like a second heartbeat. This moment. This specific moment. This was when someone cracked, when someone defended themselves, when someone's voice rose and proved every accusation about emotional instability correct. Caldwell was waiting for that. His entire strategy depended on it. The broken nurse, the one who couldn't handle the pressure, the one who needed to be removed for everyone's safety. She didn't give it to him. The procedure was indicated, Megan said, her voice level as a laser, 10 words exactly. The patient would have arrested in minutes. No apology. No explanation. No tremor. Just fact, delivered with the precision of someone who had held a field hospital together for 16 hours while mortars fell like rain. Caldwell's face tightened. This wasn't the script. "You don't have the authority to make that decision," he said, and his voice had risen a quarter octave. He was escalating because his first move hadn't landed. That was the tell. The competent predator adapts when the prey doesn't flinch. The desperate one doubles down. Morrison cleared his throat. "The liability is significant regardless," he said, and produced another document, a termination letter with St. Michael's official seal already embossed at the top. Pre-written. Pre-signed. This meeting wasn't an investigation. It was theater. The verdict had been decided in Caldwell's office sometime before dawn. Effective immediately, your employment with St. Michael's Medical Center is terminated. You'll surrender your badge and credentials to security. We're offering 2 weeks severance in exchange for a non-disparagement agreement. 2 weeks. The cost of her cover. The end of her mission. The moment when everything she'd been embedded to do would collapse because a man in a charcoal suit and a man in a white coat had decided that her competence was a liability. The older administrator signed something. Morrison slid the termination letter across the mahogany table toward her like a playing card in a losing hand. Megan picked it up, read the typed words, practicing beyond scope, demonstrated poor judgment, failure to follow protocol, effective immediately, and felt something in her chest that wasn't pain. Pain was information. Pain was data. This was something else. This was 18 years of training intersecting with the moment when the mission became impossible. Caldwell was already mentally spending the money. She could see it in the way his shoulders relaxed, the way his hand went to his pocket like he was reaching for his wallet. Another million cleared through phantom billing codes. Another shipment of inflated equipment orders. Another year of skimming from the hospital budget while the general lay in room 347 with classified intelligence that someone had tried to poison out of him. Caldwell didn't know that. He didn't know anything except that he'd just removed the one person who could keep his target alive. "Security will meet you at your locker," Morrison said, already turning back to his legal pad. "You're not authorized to access patient records or equipment after this point." Megan turned toward the door, the termination letter held in her steady hand, and that was when Caldwell made his mistake. He tried to add the final insult, the last word, the cruel punctuation that would mark his victory complete. For what it's worth, he said to her back, you were never going to survive here anyway. You're just not cut out for this level of medicine. She paused at the threshold. Didn't turn around. Didn't flinch. And when she spoke, her voice had dropped an octave, less nurse, more soldier. You have no idea who you're standing next to, Dr. Caldwell. It wasn't a threat. It was a fact delivered so quietly that only he heard it. The elevator doors opened on the 4th floor as Megan passed the nurse's station. Her locker was in the break room, the same locker where she'd kept her military challenge coin in the interior zippered pocket, the one beneath her shift rotation schedule and her CPR recertification card. Security was already waiting, 2 officers in blue uniforms who wouldn't meet her eyes. She knew how this worked. They were doing their job. Everyone was doing their job. That was the architecture that let corrupt men survive in positions of power, the bureaucratic diffusion of responsibility until nobody had to take ownership of the cruelty they were enacting. She emptied her locker in 90 seconds. No personal items. No photographs. No evidence of who she actually was. Master Chief Petty Officer Megan O'Brien traveled light. It was raining when she walked out of St. Michael's at 1200 hours on Friday. The kind of rain that fell hard on the San Diego asphalt, turning the parking lot into a mirror of gray sky and hospital lights. She sat in her car with the termination letter on the passenger seat, her hand still steady, her breathing still controlled, and allowed herself exactly 3 minutes of silence. Then her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number, room 347. Cardiac tamponade. Caldwell ordered observation protocol. ETA 36 minutes before cardiac arrest. You're the only one who can read the ultrasound correctly. Authorization from the general, do it anyway. Chief Nursing Officer Hansen waited outside room 347 with a manila envelope, her eyes fixed somewhere between Megan's shoulder and the wall behind her. The fluorescent lights cast everything in that underwater glow that made bad news look worse. Effective immediately, Hansen said, her voice soft as a confession. The board found inconsistencies in your documentation. Patient safety concerns. Practicing beyond your scope as a registered nurse. Her hands trembled slightly as she held out the envelope. Megan took it without a word, her jaw a single clean line. She didn't ask questions. She didn't defend herself. She'd learned in Marja that sometimes silence was the only power you had left. The envelope felt like nothing, tissue paper and bureaucracy and 8 months of work collapsing into 2 pieces of official letterhead. Hansen couldn't meet her eyes. I'm sorry, Megan. I tried to, she didn't finish. They both knew what she hadn't tried to do. Security arrived at the locker room at 0630. 2 officers she'd never seen before, moving with the practiced efficiency of men who'd done this 100 times. One held the termination letter while the other stood witness, clipboard ready. Practicing beyond scope. Falsified medication logs. The words sat on the page like accusations from another dimension, a universe where the patient Megan had just saved from cardiac tamponade was somehow her fault instead of her only victory in this place. She opened her locker slowly. Inside, 1 change of clothes folded against the back panel, a protein bar she'd bought on shift 3 weeks ago, and the tarnished military challenge coin she'd carried since her first deployment. She could hear the vending machine humming 2 corridors down. The same spot where orderlies had laughed about the little nurse who'd probably cry herself to sleep. Those same men stopped talking when she passed them now, their laughter dying like an engine cutting out. She didn't look at them. She never looked at them. The locker closed with a click that sounded like a door locking from the outside. Dr. Caldwell stood in the doorway of the security office, arms crossed over his chest like a man already calculating his next move. His smile was the kind that belonged on a shark, present, mechanical, missing something essential that made it human. He'd already stopped thinking about Megan. She was gone from his mind the way a successful parasite stops thinking about a host it's just abandoned. By tomorrow he'd have the equipment contracts back up. Inflated orders. Phantom billing codes. The consultant who'd helped fabricate her termination owed him a favor that he'd convert into immunity from whatever came next. Caldwell had been playing this game for 17 years. He knew every rule and how to break them without leaving marks. Megan walked past him without acknowledging his presence. That was the thing that would bother him later, not that she'd been fired, but that she'd disappeared from his awareness entirely, the way an insignificant person simply ceased to exist for someone important. He'd expected tears or anger or some flicker of the subordination he'd worked so hard to install. Instead, she was already becoming a memory, a problem solved, a threat neutralized. She drove to Harbor Drive at 0300 Saturday morning, the city sleeping around her like something wounded. San Diego at 3 in the morning was a different place, emptier, colder, honest in a way daylight never quite achieved. The diner sat on the corner near the water, the kind of place where insomniacs and people making terrible decisions gathered to drink coffee and stare at nothing. Megan took the booth in the back, the one with a view of both doors and the parking lot beyond. Old habits. The kind that didn't require permission to activate. The coffee came in a white mug that looked like it had survived 40 years of washing. It was still hot enough to steam, and Megan watched the vapor rise and dissipate, a cycle that meant nothing. The waitress, a woman in her 60s with the kind of tired that came from a lifetime of early shifts, didn't ask questions. She just refilled the cup twice and left Megan alone with the weight of what had just happened. The challenge coin sat on the table between the salt and pepper shakers. She picked it up. Put it down. Picked it up again. The metal was worn smooth from 8 years of her thumb pressing against it during moments like this, moments when the mission was the only thing real enough to hold on to. 8 years as a Master Chief Petty Officer. 3 Bronze Stars for actions in Helmand Province. 2 Purple Hearts from wounds that had left scars across her left shoulder blade and lower ribs, scar tissue that told stories no one at St. Michael's had bothered to ask about. She'd spent 16 hours holding a field hospital together in Marja under mortar fire, performing emergency surgeries with her hand steady and her mind 3 steps ahead of death itself. And then she'd been fired by a hospital in San Diego for being too competent at her job. The coffee went cold. The fluorescent lights buzzed their relentless hum. Somewhere out on the bay, a foghorn announced nothing to no one. She stared at her reflection in the window and saw exactly what everyone else had seen, just another nurse. Just another woman who couldn't quite manage the politics, who'd pushed too hard, who'd asked too many questions about medication discrepancies and equipment billing. The mask she'd worn for 8 months had finally slipped, and beneath it was nothing but another failure. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that General Marcus Hale was still in room 347, still recovering from cardiac tamponade that should have killed him. He'd opened his eyes 3 hours ago when she'd placed the challenge coin on his bedside table, his burned fingers reaching for it like recognition had a physical form. And now she'd walked away from an active naval intelligence operation, abandoning a classified asset to a doctor who'd already tried to kill him once through negligence and would try again through deliberate design. Walking out meant surrendering. She picked up the coin again. Ran her thumb across the raised insignia, a unit patch, a timestamp, a reminder of what she was supposed to be doing. The waitress refilled her coffee for the 3rd time, saying nothing, the kind of silence between strangers that was its own form of kindness. Megan watched the new coffee steam in the cold mug, watched it cool, watched herself disappear into the reflection in the window. Master Chief Petty Officer Megan O'Brien, reduced to a woman in an empty diner at 3 in the morning, holding a tarnished coin and wondering if 8 years of everything, every scar, every life saved, every impossible decision made in impossible light, had all led to this one moment of absolute defeat. The diner door opened at 0347. 3 men in tactical gear walked directly to her booth, boots loud on linoleum, moving with the kind of purpose that made civilians instinctively look away. The lead operator had the build and bearing of someone who'd made a career out of complexity, scarred knuckles, eyes that had seen too much, a posture like a loaded weapon at rest. Behind them came a 4th figure, older, moving with the careful gait of someone who'd earned that caution over decades. Behind them, appearing in the doorway like an apparition from another life, stood the night security guard from St. Michael's, a 60-year-old Navy veteran named Mercer who'd nodded to her every evening for 8 months without ever crossing the line into familiarity. The lead operator spoke first, voice clipped, command structure built into every syllable. "Valkyrie, you're needed immediately." He didn't pause, didn't offer explanation. "The asset is awake and requesting you by name." The waitress dropped a ceramic plate. It shattered across the tile floor in a sound like sharp applause. Megan didn't move. For exactly 2 seconds, the world held its breath. Then Mercer stepped forward, his voice cracking slightly as it moved through the register of someone recognizing another person's true weight for the first time. "That's Master Chief Petty Officer O'Brien, son." Each word landed like a hammer strike. "You address her by rank." The hospital administrator who'd signed her termination letter appeared in the doorway behind Mercer, his face draining of color like someone had pulled a plug somewhere inside his chest. Megan set down her coffee. Set down the coin. Stood up with a kind of movement that looked effortless because the person performing it had practiced it in 17 different combat zones across 3 deployments. "I'm going on break," she said to the waitress, her voice carrying a weight it hadn't held 5 seconds ago. The waitress nodded as if this made perfect sense, even though everyone in that diner understood that Megan O'Brien wasn't coming back to this booth, wasn't coming back to being whoever she'd been pretending to be. She picked up the challenge coin and walked toward the tactical team, toward Mercer, toward the parking lot where 2 SUVs waited with their engines running, light steady but no sirens, the kind of silence that meant this operation was moving beyond the point where anyone needed warning. The diner door opened and 3 men in tactical gear walked directly to her booth. The lead operator's voice cut through the fluorescent hum like a blade through silk. "Valkyrie, you're needed immediately." Not a question. Not a request. A command spoken loud enough that the waitress dropped a plate and it shattered across the checkered floor. Megan stood. The challenge coin disappeared into her pocket. Her hands were steady. Her face remained unreadable, the same mask she'd worn through 8 months of humiliation, through grand rounds and vending machine whispers and termination letters signed in triplicate. The night security guard from St. Michael's stepped in behind the tactical team. He was a Navy veteran, maybe 60, with hands that had held rifles before they'd held clipboards. He looked at the lead operator with the kind of stare that said he'd outranked everyone in that diner by sunrise. "That's Master Chief Petty Officer O'Brien, son, you address her by rank." His voice cracked with recognition, the kind of break that comes from understanding you'd been standing next to a legend the entire time and never knew it. The operator's posture shifted imperceptibly. Respect rewired itself in the space between heartbeats. "Master Chief. Transport is 2 minutes out." Megan moved past them toward the door. The tactical team reformed around her like her on a guard. Outside, the San Diego night was cool and salt-heavy, the kind of dark that comes before the city wakes. 2 black SUVs idled at the curb, engines running, lights steady. No sirens. No theatrics. This was the kind of operation that moved in silence. The ride back to St. Michael's took 8 minutes. Nobody spoke. The rotor wash hit the parking lot before they even rounded the corner to the ER entrance, a UH-60M Black Hawk descending through the fog like something out of mythology. The hospital staff would see it. They would stand at their windows and wonder. By morning, speculation would spread through the ICU like for fluid through tubing, but no one would have answers except the ones they invented. Inside, the elevator rose to the 4th floor. The doors opened onto the ICU corridor. The night nurse roster scattered, everyone who'd laughed in break rooms, everyone who'd watched Caldwell humiliate her in grand rounds, everyone who'd said nothing. They walked directly to room 347. The general was sitting upright in his hospital bed, no longer comatose, no longer silent. His burned hand held a file folder. His eyes, the color of storm-gray Atlantic, locked onto hers and held. He began to read. His voice was like gravel being crushed under a tank tread, rough, authoritative, carrying weight that shook the walls of the small room. Master Chief Petty Officer Megan O'Brien. Service record begins 2015, Naval Special Warfare Command. 3 Bronze Stars. He paused. The words hung in the air like shrapnel. 2 Purple Hearts. Another pause. The room seemed to compress, the air pressure changing. And a Navy cross. Actions in Marja, Helmand Province. Combat zone. 18 hours under siege. Field hospital collapse. You held a structure together with your own body. He looked up from the file. You shielded my position while I called in air support. Enemy rounds came through the south wall. One of them was meant for my spine. The general reached into his bedside drawer and pulled out a tarnished challenge coin. It matched the one in Megan's pocket like mirror images. Same military insignia. Same weight. Same history. He held it up to the fluorescent light and it caught the glow like a small sun. I've carried this for 8 years wondering if you were alive. Wondering if you made it out of Marja. Wondering if you ever forgave me for surviving when so many didn't. His voice dropped. Then a young Navy corpsman brought me back from unconsciousness using a technique I've only ever seen in one place on Earth. The Marja Field Hospital Protocol. Only one person on active duty still uses that grip. The door opened. A woman in a dark suit stepped forward, late 40s, with the kind of posture that comes from carrying authority like a briefcase. FBI Special Agent Torres. Behind her, 2 more agents. Torres approached the hospital bed with the kind of deliberate calm that says she'd been building this case for months, waiting for the right moment to turn the key. Master Chief O'Brien, I'm Special Agent Torres. We've been investigating St. Michael's supply contracts for 6 months. Your requisition patterns flagged anomalies that helped establish probable cause for a federal investigation. She held up a tablet. The screen showed procurement records, equipment invoices, phantom billing codes. Number spiraled, $340,000 in kickbacks. 18 months of fraud. Equipment orders that never arrived. Medicare charges for supplies that never existed. Torres continued, her voice level and measured. We have evidence of inflated equipment billing, fabricated orders for ventilators and hemodynamic monitoring systems that were invoiced to the hospital and routed to private clinics that Dr. Caldwell owns. We have his personal emails discussing pharmaceutical kickbacks. And we have proof that he falsified incident reports about you, specifically the one he filed claiming you practiced beyond your scope during the general's medical crisis. She swiped the tablet. New images appeared. Her charts, Megan's actual documentation, pristine and meticulous. And then overlaid, Caldwell's altered versions, timestamps showing he'd photographed her original work and then photoshopped medication entries, dosage errors, procedure notations that never existed. His phone had stored the modified versions. The hospital server had stored the originals. The evidence was both. We recovered the originals from the backup system, Torres said. We recovered his falsifications from his personal iPhone. We have geolocation data showing he was in his office at 2:41 a.m. when the general crashed, and security footage of him in the hallway 15 minutes later, deliberately delaying Dr. Kim's arrival to the room by taking a call and speaking loudly about a restaurant reservation. The door burst open. Dr. Caldwell stood in the frame. His face cycled through emotions like a broken projector, confidence, then confusion, then pale understanding. Then red. The kind of red that comes from rage meeting terminal recognition. He turned to leave. His shoes hit the linoleum moving fast. But the agents had anticipated this, had positioned themselves accordingly. 3 more of them stood in the corridor, waiting. The kind of waiting that comes with handcuffs already in grip. His voice climbed an octave. This is absurd, I want my lawyer, these records are falsified. Torres held up the tablet again. You falsified incident reports about Master Chief O'Brien. You photographed her charts and altered them. She stepped closer. We have the originals from the hospital server and your modified versions from your phone. We've traced the emails. 18 months of kickback requests to Fortis Medical Supply. $12,000 per month, routed through shell corporations. Do you know who I am? Caldwell's voice cracked. I've been at this hospital for 12 years. I'm chief of intensive care. My family has donated. You're under arrest for healthcare fraud, obstruction of federal investigation, and falsifying federal documents. The agent said it the way you'd announce the weather. The handcuffs clicked. Not gently. The metallic sound echoed down the ICU corridor like a judge's gavel. Every nurse within earshot heard it. Every resident. The two orderlies from the vending machine, they heard it and stared at their shoes. They walked Caldwell past room 347. Megan stood at the threshold in her scrubs, body at perfect attention, face still stone. Caldwell spat words like venom. You smug bitch, you'll never work in medicine again. You think you've won something? You destroyed yourself. The general's voice cut through like a combat blade. That woman has saved more lives than you've seen in charts, doctor. The only person finished here is you. Caldwell's face went grey. They walked him toward the elevator, his shoes squeaking on linoleum, and the ICU fell into a silence so complete you could hear the ventilators breathing in neighboring rooms. Chief Nursing Officer Hansen approached Megan in the corridor. Her face was pale, her voice small. Master Chief, I am so. Megan cut her off with a single look. Where were you during grand rounds? Hansen had no answer. Had no words. She turned and walked away. Megan returned to room 347. She checked the general's vitals with the precision of someone who'd performed the same actions under mortar fire. Blood pressure stable. Heart rate controlled. O2 saturation 97% on room air. She adjusted his fall line, a routine movement that had become muscle memory across 2 decades. Mission complete, sir, she said quietly. The general smiled. His burned hand reached out and squeezed her forearm. The grip was strong. The gratitude was stronger. Outstanding work, Master Chief. You never broke cover. Negative, sir. You were the asset. Keeping you alive was the mission. 6 months later, Megan O'Brien stood in the St. Michael's parking lot in dress whites, the morning sun catching her ribbons like they were made of light itself. Bronze stars arranged in ascending order. Purple hearts. And the Navy Cross, positioned highest, where it belonged, catching the dawn like a medal meant to shine forever. Inside Conference Room B, the same room where Caldwell had projected her charts on a screen and called her documentation dangerously sloppy, the hospital board unveiled a plaque mounted in dark walnut, the O'Brien ICU. In honor of Master Chief Petty Officer Megan O'Brien, whose courage protects us all. General Hale, fully recovered, stood in his service dress uniform. His burned hand had healed into new tissue that told its own story. He approached Megan with the kind of formal respect you give to rank and earned honors. He pinned the Legion of Merit on her chest and held the salute for 3 full seconds. The room went dead silent. Through the window of the hospital, visible across the street in the community college parking lot, a figure demonstrated CPR compressions on a plastic dummy. Dr. Caldwell. $18 an hour. No white coat. No credentials. A dozen bored students in folding chairs, one of them texting, another with her eyes closed. This was the same parking lot from 6 months ago. Megan could see the exact spot where FBI agents had walked him to their car in handcuffs. She could draw a line with her eyes and mark the trajectory of his fall. The 2 vending machine orderlies stood at attention in the back of the audience. The EMT who'd recognized her Marja protocol salute stood with tears in his eyes. Chief Nursing Officer Hansen tried to shake Megan's hand when this was over. Megan's grip was professional, brief, cold as winter water. There was no forgiveness to offer. There was only the recognition of where people had stood when the light came searching. At the podium, General Hale addressed the assembled staff, our nurses, residents, administrators, the entire ICU team. This woman saved my life twice. Once in Marja under mortar fire. Once in this hospital under bureaucratic fire. She never broke cover. Never flinched. Never quit. Most of you stood next to her for 8 months and never knew who she was. That's what true professionalism looks like. That's what honor looks like when it doesn't need an audience. Megan stepped to the microphone. Her voice was steady, measured, carrying the kind of authority that comes from having survived the worst and chosen grace anyway. Power is not a title. Power is the ability to help. She touched the tarnished challenge coin in her pocket. The general had his matching one pin to his uniform. Two pieces of the same proof, separated by years, brought together in a diner at 3 in the morning. The applause started quietly. Then it built until it filled the room like a tide. If you're watching this, you know there are people in your world who look ordinary, who wear regular clothes, who get passed over and dismissed and underestimated. They're sitting at desks next to you. They're ringing up your groceries. They're pushing medical carts down hallways. They've survived things that would break most people. They carry strength so quietly that no one notices until the moment they need it. When someone in your life gets overlooked, get them recognized. Like this video. Subscribe. Share it with someone who needs to remember that true power walks in silence. True heroes don't need applause. But they deserve it.